All right, human geography students, we are going to move on to our notes for 3.2. So this is Unit 3, Notes Session 2. So we're going to continue with culture, our unit on culture. We're going to get into cultural patterns, and we are also going to take a look at language in these notes. Okay, so the first concept I want to talk about is acculturation. Acculturation happens when cultures come into contact and one culture often dominates another culture. So think of an example of the Spanish conquistadors arriving in the New World. We have the indigenous peoples coming into contact with the Europeans, and the Europeans dominating the indigenous peoples, and that gives you an example of acculturation. All right, so acculturation occurs when the less dominant culture adopts some of the traits of the more influential one. It typically takes place when immigrants take on the following in their new community. They adopt values, attitudes, customs, and speech. And to go back to my original example, we saw acculturation when the Europeans arrive in Latin America and the indigenous peoples begin to adopt Spanish as their language. All right, so acculturation is often talked about at the same time as assimilation, and I think the discussion between acculturation and assimilation might be an interesting topic for a Socratic seminar. So assimilation, if over time immigrants lose their native customs, including their own religion and their own language, assimilation has occurred. This means that the dominant culture completely absorbs the less dominant one. And it sometimes takes a long time for this to happen. It might take several generations for assimilation to occur. So we're going to move on to transculturation. What is transculturation? So there is sometimes a two-way flow of culture that will reflect a more equal exchange of cultural traits, and this process is called transculturation. So when there is a back and forth sharing of cultural ideas. So an example of transculturation would be, computer's moving a little slow. All right, so Buddhism. It originated in India, but it diffuses throughout Eastern Asia and came into contact with Confucianism, which is found primarily in China. So both forces were strong and transculturation occurs. Buddhism and Confucianism remained in place to influence large populations throughout East Asia, and you still see these religions practiced today in East Asia. All right, two more concepts that are part of this unit are ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. These are important not just in terms of understanding the important content for AP Human Geography, but also keeping our own personal points of view open and attempting to remain bias-free as much as possible. All right, so what is the difference? All right, ethnocentrism is the practice of judging another culture by the standards of one's own culture. So judging what someone does is right or wrong based on your cultural beliefs and your cultural values. Cultural relativism is the practice of evaluating a culture by its own standards. All right, so ethnocentrism can sometimes generate misunderstanding and conflict, and that kind of seems maybe a little bit obvious if you are judging someone from your own point of view rather than trying to put yourself in their shoes and understand their perspective. So on a smaller scale, ethnocentrism is necessary for people to be emotionally attached to their way of life. So there is some necessity involved in ethnocentrism because it gives you, it gets you invested in your culture. If one culture considers itself to be superior, however, then conflict can occur. So if you're ethnocentric, but you have an equality-based point of view, then you're going to lessen the likelihood of conflict. But if you experience ethnocentrism along with the belief that your culture is superior, then this is going to lead to conflict. So an example of ethnocentrism, Europeans and North Americans sometimes refer to China as the Far East because China is far east of Europe and North America. So we are judging its location based on our point of view. The term is unfamiliar to the Chinese, who sometimes refer to their country as the Middle Kingdom because they perceive China to be at the center of the world. Now, if you look at most modern maps, you're going to find that pretty consistently there is one country that is at the center of all maps, and that's going to be Great Britain, largely because a lot of the projections that were established like the Mercator and the Robinson, you're going to find they're established at a time when Britain was at its height of the British Empire. And so Britain was the, or they perceived themselves to be in an ethnocentric way, that they were the center of the world. China views itself as being the center or the middle of the world and therefore calls itself the Middle Kingdom. Those who practice cultural relativism believe that seeking to understand other cultures in the modern world is crucial because of increasing contact with one another. Because of globalization, it is important to understand the practices of another culture. But cultural relativism has its critics. Critics, however, point out the problems that come with accepting all actions and values as equal. Their belief is that cultural relativism could lead an individual to ignore or dismiss those behaviors or ideas that are clearly harmful or unjust. So, for example, if a culture places genders on an unequal basis, if you just say, well, that's their culture and that's okay, then we are turning a blind eye to behaviors or ideas that are clearly harmful or unjust. All right, an important vocabulary term for you to know is syncretism. So what is it? Syncretism is the fusion of the old and the new. It helps explain how and why cultural changes occur. These changes lead to a wide range of differences, including differences in language and religion. And if you'll remember, language and religion, very important part of culture. So we're going to talk specifically now about language, and I think language is fascinating. So what is it? Language is a systematic means of communicating ideas and feelings through the use of signs, gestures, marks, or vocal sounds. Language is the key to the world of culture. No other single culture trait more commonly binds people together because language is a set of symbols that allows people to communicate with one another, and without communication, you cannot build relationships within a community. Language is also important from an AP perspective because the FRQ questions that have been on previous AP exams, if they're coming from the culture unit, they're almost always coming from the language point of the cultural unit, also ethnicity. So even the basic rules for writing will differ among cultures. So for example, most people in Western societies write from left to right, but people in North Africa and Western Asia write from right to left, and people in Eastern Asia write from top to bottom. So when we think of writing and reading, we Americans, English, Western Europeans read left to right, top to bottom. But as you can see, in different parts of the world, that is not a standard practice. Language also helps to ensure the continuity of culture or cultural transmission from one generation to the next. Every society transmits culture through speech, and most today also pass it along through writing. So if you think of history in a more, we think back to the Middle Ages, or we think back to even prehistory, the time before writing, stories and knowledge of the people that have come before us were passed down through an oral tradition. The idea that the majority of people that live in a culture have the ability to read and write is a relatively modern one. The preservation of culture is more likely to last if people in a society can read and write. So as reading and writing and literacy have become more common, the preservation of our culture, at least in terms of historical perspective, is going to mean that our culture may have a slightly longer lasting impact. Linguists are people who study languages. They estimate that between 5,000 and 6,000 languages are in use in the world today, with some much more widely used than others. I find that kind of a mind-blowing number. When we think of languages that are offered to high school students, you can guess that, a lot of students take Spanish, a lot of students take French, some students take German, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, I can think of less than 10 languages that are typically offered at high school campuses, and maybe just a few more that are offered on college campuses. However, there are 5,000 to 6,000 different languages in the world, so that's a pretty astonishing number. So the most commonly spoken languages, if you had written down a list of the most commonly spoken languages prior to seeing this slide, English certainly would have been at the top, and that might have been a more ethnocentric view. But when we think in terms of population and which countries are the most populous, it should not be surprising that the most commonly spoken language is Chinese. And these are percentages for first language speakers only. This does not count people who speak Chinese as a second language, or who speak Spanish or English as a second language, and so on. So you can see that we have Chinese, Spanish, English, Arabic, Hindi, Bengali, Portuguese, Russian, Japanese, and then standard German. The most commonly spoken languages have diffused in many ways through trade, through conquests, and through migrations. English is commonly understood to be the language of business around the world. Spanish is widely spoken because Spain colonized much of Latin America, diffusing its language and religion. And so you see the use of Spanish language along with the Portuguese language primarily in South America, Central America, and Mexico, as well as the Caribbean. So these human movements, whether it is moving ideas and money, moving armies, or moving people, languages, the most spoken languages, have been spread around the world primarily through diffusion. Languages are often grouped into families with a shared but fairly distant origin. So example would be the Indo-European family of languages. Languages in this family are spoken by more than 1/2 of the world's people. English is the most widely used language in this family. Some areas of the world are characterized by linguistic fragmentation, which is a condition in which many languages are spoken, each by a relatively small number of people. An example of linguistic fragmentation would be the Caucasus region of Eastern Europe. Many different culture groups have settled here and retained their languages. Today, several thousand languages are spoken by fewer than 2 million people. So that means you're much more likely to encounter someone who does not speak your language than you would, say, living in Atlanta, Georgia. Another language family that's a part of the Indo-European language family are the Romance languages. They form what is known as a subfamily with origins in Latin, and the Romance languages include Spanish, French, and Italian. Theorists differ as to how languages originally diffused, like how did all of these different languages come about. Some analysts believe that it was by conquest. Others argue that it was the diffusion of agricultural practices. The Black Sea is believed to be the heart of the Indo-European languages. So the sources of the 10 major languages throughout the world, so there are thousands of languages spoken today. The majority of people in the world speak one of the languages indicated on the map below. The map shows the origins of these languages before they diffuse to many other areas of the world. So this shows you the hearth where these languages come from. And obviously these languages have diffused worldwide, but you're seeing where they originated, where they were born. All right, so we have standard languages and we have official languages. So standard languages are recognized by the government and the intellectual elite as the norm for use in schools, government, media, and other aspects of public life. Official languages, well, let me make one more point. So often the dialects identified with a country's capital city or center of power are standard languages. Official languages it's the language that is endorsed and recognized by the government as one that everyone should know and use. So, for example, in the United States, we do not have an official language, a language established by law to be the official language of the land. English is the standard language because it is the language that is used in schools, government, media, and aspects of public life. Canada, however, does have official languages. It has two official languages, and that would be Canadian and French. So that means that you can conduct business in French, you can be taught in school in French, and French can be a common language in the media. Now, primarily, you're going to see that in the province of Quebec, and then in the rest of Canada, you're going to see English as the primary language. But official languages are the legally established languages. Standard language is a language that is just commonly accepted as that is just used by the majority. Dialects are regional variants of a standard language. Dialects reflect differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, pace of speech, faster or slower, and different phrases. So if you think about about American English, and there is a difference between American and British English. Even within American English, you have a Southern dialect, which is slower, and you have a Northeastern dialect, which is faster, and you even have some vocabulary differences between these two regions. An isogloss is a boundary within which certain languages or dialects are spoken. An isogloss is not a clear line of demarcation. It's not like an official boundary. However, with the use of particular words fading as the boundary is approached. So when dealing with language barriers, you have people who are bilingual, and bilingualism is the ability to communicate in two languages. Multilingualism is the ability to communicate in more than two languages. Long-term contact between less skilled people sometimes results in the creation of a pidgin, a collection of languages that borrows words from several. So essentially, a pidgin is a hybrid language. An example would be Lingala. Lingala is a hybrid of Congolese dialects in Africa that the French invented to aid in communication among 270 different ethnic groups. A lingua franca is an established language that comes to be spoken and understood over a large area. A contemporary example of that is English, which is a language of international communication, and it's often used in international business affairs because, as I said before, English is the language of business. So when you take a look at this map, we have the modern area around the Mediterranean Sea. Most of the area around the Mediterranean Sea was dominated by the Roman Empire by the early 2nd century Common Era. As political power spread, Latin becomes the lingua franca of the area. Once the empire fell, the area reverted to cultural practices of various ethnicities as reflected in the country and city names on the modern map. Latin blended with native tongues to create modern languages of Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, and Portuguese. So a review of some of the things we talked about in Unit 1. So we talked about toponyms in Unit 1. Toponymy is the study of place names, a special interest of linguistic geographers. So how do places get their names? A careful study of a map can reveal cultural identities and histories by simply noticing names of geographical and political figures. So place names may honor kings, queens, or heroes. So for a modern day American example is Virginia was named for the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. They may reflect geographical origins. An example is that New York is named after the city of York in England. They may be descriptive, describing physical or cultural features, the Rocky Mountains. They may denote incidents or events. So example, Battle Creek, Michigan. They may commemorate religious figures. An example of that would be St. Louis, Missouri. Languages can go extinct. So extinct languages were once in use but are no longer spoken or read in daily activities by anyone in the world. The process of extinction seems to be accelerating in modern times due to communication and transportation improvements. So think of that time-space convergence. An example of extinct languages is the Gothic language. Some ethnic groups do attempt to preserve their language, even though very few people may speak it. Ethnic groups have pushed for measures to preserve their languages, such as the movement in Wales, which is in the United Kingdom, to continue to teach Welsh, not just English, in their schools. So if you look at the map at the bottom, you can see that Wales is on the western edge of the United Kingdom. Other attempts at preserving languages include the European Union's Bureau of Lesser Used Languages. They provide financial support to preserve languages, and there have been special efforts made to preserve the Celtic languages of the British Isles. In Peru and Quechua, Spanish has been the dominant language in Peru since it was conquered by Spain in the 16th century by the conquistadors Francisco Pizarro. The use of Quechua, the native language, has declined in recent years. It was the native language of the Incas, and the native language has been in use mainly in rural areas. So on a national level, legislators in Peru have delivered speeches before Peru's Congress in Quechua, and that gives that's a very symbolic gesture about the importance of preserving the language. On an international level, Google has launched a version of its search engine in the native language, and Microsoft has added translations in Quechua to its Windows and Office programs. In 2006, Peru's president signed a law making discrimination on the basis of language a criminal offense. So you can see that this is a pretty major attempt to preserve a language. Okay, so key terms from this session: acculturation, assimilation, transculturation, ethnocentrism, cultural relativism, syncretism, language, cultural transmission, a linguist, linguistic fragmentation, language family, language subfamily, standard language, official language, and the differences between the two, dialects, isogloss, bilingual, multilingual, pidgin, lingua franca, toponymy.